There is a 125-year history of healthcare provided on the very grounds where Kensington Health Centre and the hospice now stand. Understanding the historical significance of the chapel lies in its connection to the medical care provided just south of the chapel since 1888. Where the current Kensington Gardens buildings stand at 25 and 45 Brunswick Avenue was the St. John Surgical Hospital for Women, established by the Anglican Sisters of St. John the Divine in 1888. The sisters were an extraordinary group of women. They were trained nurses committed to opening a surgical hospital to provide medical care for poor and needy women in Toronto, regardless of race and religion. The institution's primary goal was to stabilize the high maternal and infant mortality rates that prevailed in Canada from the 1880s to the 1920s. So that the hospital did not totally rely on charity, well-appointed private rooms were also available for those who could afford to pay. The stone that you see in the hospice foyer was the cornerstone laid in the women's hospital when it was built in 1888. The hospital met a great need in Toronto and operated at full capacity with a waiting list. In an attempt to meet some of the demand, the hospital, chapel, and convent were converted into patient rooms. The 38 Major Street Chapel was built in 1892 to replace the hospital, convent, and chapel space that was lost. The building was designed by Mr. Frank Darling, a Canadian architect that largely influenced many of the structures built in Toronto in the late 19th century. However, Mr. Darling's design was altered by the Reverend Mother, who urged him to comply with her aesthetic tastes. One of the most noted features was the rood screen. Rood screens were a common feature in late medieval church architecture and would normally be a sculptural representation of the crucifixion. Typical of most rood screens, on either side there would be statues of Mary and St. John. Instead, in the Major Street Chapel, there was a semicircle stained glass window above the altar depicting Mary and St. John. The window was referred to as the Mary Window. The Mother Foundress was also influential in determining the design of the chapel ceiling, which caused conflict for Mr. Darling's design plans. He argued that the ceiling should have beams between the walls in order to support the red cedar roof. Other architects were consulted and agreed with the plans of the chief architect. However, Mother Foundress countered that such strong reinforcement would be aesthetically unappealing, and she ordered to have the steeple erected without it. Ultimately, the mother was successful in ensuring that the design of the ceiling would suit her vision of arches that rise without beams, obstructing the view of the vista from the entrance of the chapel to the altar. The wooden arches have remained in their original form to this day. The hospital had a distinguished career for 62 years and overcame many serious financial difficulties during that time. Eventually, the hospital could not compete with the secularized government hospitals that received large budgets and were able to provide medical services a lot more affordably than privately run religious hospitals. The Women's Hospital was closed in 1937, but continued to provide services to the Kensington community for geriatric care until 1953, when the hospital was purchased by the Raxlin brothers and the name was changed to Doctors' Hospital. When the sisters moved, they deconsecrated the chapel and removed all of its ecclesiastical artifacts. Following deconsecration, the chapel served a variety of secular functions. The principal one was the utilization of the space as a meeting and lecture room for the Doctors' Hospital. High above the front of the lecture room can be seen a blocked space, which had contained the removed stained glass Mary Window. Following the closure of the Doctors' Hospital in 1997, the chapel was used for a variety of activities. The building became derelict, but because it was over 100 years old, it was a listed historical building and protected from demolition. In keeping with the tradition of providing healthcare services on these grounds, it is a most fitting conversion of the chapel to become a hospice, providing 24-hour end-of-life care to individuals and their families. We can draw some similarities between the hospice and the original women's surgical hospital. The hospice is also supported by its community and strives to provide a home-like environment and to care for those whose palliative symptoms are often inadequately managed in the mainstream healthcare system. We hope to be making history with the care we are providing today.